Yeah, we definitely can do that, and I'll ask you questions along the way as well. But yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, as I said, I guess this particular story is a pretty salient. I'm turning red already. This story is, I think, a salient story for what not to do in your first capital raise. Even though my partner was very senior, as I said, on the public side, on the state side for multifamily, and I had this kind of 20 plus year career raising capital, there's no running away from the fact that for both of us, it was our first syndication. So we had both owned property for a long time, but we had either owned that property off our own balance sheets or in joint ventures. We hadn't actually done a syndication yet. Despite that, I thought naively and incorrectly that we could get away with, given who he was and who I thought I was, we could get away with not getting a sponsor and a really solid GP team with the requisite level of experience to do the capital raise. And I can tell you that I was absolutely wrong. But prior to that, I guess the kind of acquisition of the property itself was an absolute odyssey. The first problem was that we had a broker who didn't know what he was selling. This was or is an income, what's called an income restricted property. So in essence, the owner is required to provide a certain percentage of the apartments to certain tenants within certain income ranges. And in exchange for that, we receive a full tax abatement. These are wonderful deals and highly sought after in Texas. And so we were quite excited when this was brought to us. Initially, it was brought to us as a 10% deal, which means we thought, and the broker told us, that 10% of the apartments were subject to this particular arrangement, and the rest we could lease out as we wanted. We do our numbers, we put in a bid, we start negotiations, we go through the process, and then the broker comes to us and said, "Oh, guys, yeah, sorry about that. It's actually the case that 50% of the apartments subject to the restrictions." And we said, huh, all right, okay. So back we go. We do our numbers. We repeat the negotiations. We put in a bid. And in the process of putting a bid, we thought, you know what, we'll just do a check. We'll check what the LURA or Land Use Regulatory Agreement, which is the agreement that covers all this. And lo and behold, 90% of units were subject to this particular restriction. So we went back and for a third time tried to renegotiate, tried to redo the numbers and restart the process. Now, every time that we did this, the process had to go through the approval process of the city, which is vastly different to an institutional approval process or indeed an individual considering your offer. We didn't fully ever really get to the bottom of what the process was, but we do know that there were multiple individuals, all of who had their own agenda and their own say, their own level of power, and their wish to either facilitate or disrupt the transaction. And it was very rare. We would reach agreement with the point person who was the city manager, and the thing would just get blown up time after time. This went on for about 7 to 8 months. And then just as
Mm.
we thought we were beaten and it was done, we got an agreement. Okay, fantastic. We're ready to start our capital raise. I think the first mistake, Tim, that I made is what I alluded to before, which was there's no running away from the fact that if you are starting out on your syndication journey, you need to be part of a team that has GPs and or sponsors that have the requisite level of experience and expertise and balance sheet. It should be added. we I guess we thought that we could be a little bit cheeky and not do that because we were the recipient of we assumed a really odd loan as part of the transaction. The loan was a credit loan and not an asset-based loan. So essentially the lender said to us, the first thing that we did after we got the property under contract was to go to the lender and say to the lender, do you need us to have a sponsor by any chance? And the lender essentially said, look, I don't really care about you guys. As long as the loan is still, as long as the city, I should say, is still effectively guaranteeing the loan and is on the hook, you guys are pretty peripheral. So we went great. So that was, and off we went thinking that we could do this deal without getting sponsors and GPs with experience on board, and it's not going to fly. It didn't fly with any of the equity providers, and ultimately the debt provider came back to us just before the deal closed and said it's not going to fly for us as well. So I would strongly suggest that, and you'll be made to do that by the debt provider in any event. The
So,
second
so,
thing,
re- so
yeah,
real quick before you go to the second thing. So after closing, the city is still on the hook for the loan as well, in addition to you guys being on the hook for the loan. Is that correct?
yeah, yeah, it's a really unusual deal in many respects, and that's just one of them. So I guess to facilitate this deal getting done, the city agreed to effectively be one of the key guarantors of the loan.
Mm.
Now, having said all
Uh,
that, we have an indemnification agreement. So it's not like we've suddenly got this enormous, and it is a substantial loan. It's around $30 million where we are not responsible. So ultimately, we are responsible, but the city agreed to stay in the transaction for a certain period, keep various cash amounts in escrow, which are required by the lender, all so
mm.
that we could assume the loan, which is absolutely a blessing. Don't get me wrong. But what it did was incorrectly allow us to think that we could get away without having a sponsor.
Gotcha. All right, let's go to your point number two.
All right. I guess we really, when I say we, it's I thought that we structured this transaction so that we were able to actually pay our investors more, but we brought to market a transaction that was paying over 30% per annum on an annualized average return basis. And so naively, I thought, you know what, if I bring this transaction to market, if we bring this transaction to market, then if we bring it, they will come. This is such a great transaction that we can do so many other things wrong. Class A transaction paying that amount of money, it'll sell itself. And that couldn't have been more wrong. So essentially what I did, which was an enormous mistake, was I approached this in the same way that I had raised capital as a banker, which essentially was you come up with a structure, you take that structure or idea or transaction to another bank or another institution, and essentially the bank and the institution looks at the structure, they look at the bank and the institution that I'm from, and they don't really care about Ian Drewe. I'm nothing in the equation. And so I thought that if we just brought this to market without having done the kind of correct legwork, again, this thing would sell itself. And multifamily capital raising is a completely different notion. And so what I didn't do was in the period between 2022, when I spoke to all of my investors and lined them up and got them ready to go, I essentially, by 2024, when we brought this to market, those relationships had gotten really cold. And I hadn't nurtured my investors. I hadn't looked after my investors. I'd simply spoken to them, introduced them to the asset, and expected them to be hanging around saying, oh, this is fantastic. I can't wait for this guy to bring us a transaction. It doesn't work like that. And that was, I think, the second enormous mistake that I made, which was completely failing to nurture the investors that I had, the relationships that I'd made in 2022. And so I hadn't done two things. I hadn't nurtured them for the period up until our first capital raise, and I hadn't really approached them prior to the capital raise to say, here's the asset. What do you guys think? And to gauge interest prior to going into the transaction. Again, I naively and somewhat arrogantly thought if I just bring this transaction, everyone's going to want it. Wasn't the case. Okay. Sorry, I've got on my list. The fourth mistake was getting a divorce right at the start of the capital raise. I'll assume that people won't be doing that. The fifth mistake that we made was, I guess, working with an investor portal that wasn't recognized. So we were sold, and I won't mention them here, but people can reach out to me afterwards to find out who it is. I did the kind of in a series of emails based on using a particular investor portal, and essentially we thought that the size and the asset class and the returns was perfect for a family office. We spent a lot of money and a lot of time lining up the family offices, and we sent a series of emails, including webinar invitations, using the technology of a particular portal. And after about 5 or 6 emails, I had 0 responses. And Tim, I'm thinking, what is going on here? This is nuts. This is a really good transaction. We should be getting enormous amounts of feedback and inquiries and all this kind of good stuff. It turned out that when I actually went back into the portal, the first email had successfully worked, but the second, third, fourth, and fifth email never went out. The portal simply didn't work, and it was an unproven, untested, simply bad system. And so it was the worst situation, the worst of both worlds, if you will, because we had this initial email go out saying, hi, we're Evoca Property. We've got this wonderful transaction. Look out for all these emails. And then absolute silence. And so that was a complete and unmitigated disaster. So there we were now a couple of months into, and so I, as a postscript, I went to the portal and said, guys, your portal doesn't work. And they looked at it and said, yeah, we can't see any, you didn't send any emails, so you're lying. And it was trying to prove a negative. Absolute disaster. The sixth area where we made our mistake was working with digital marketing firms that did not offer, not a guaranteed there, nothing is guaranteed, but we were inundated with digital marketing firms. And don't get me wrong, there must be some real, in fact, we found one. I know that there are, but in amongst the really good digital marketing firms, there are some awful digital marketing firms. And if a digital marketing firm says to you, we're going to bring you X number of investors in a certain time period in exchange for you paying us Y dollars, then look at the contract. Because if the contract does not say, we will give you, in exchange for you paying us Y dollars, we will give you X number of investors, they won't. And they must have seen me coming a mile away, because on two separate occasions, and I say this as a lawyer for heaven's sake, two separate occasions I signed agreements which didn't compel them to do anything. And you know what happened? They didn't do anything. I'm not sure which was most egregious. The second guy in particular took our money and then said to us after about 3 weeks, guys, this is too hard. I don't think we're going to get there. I said, oh, if you're not going to try or not going to get there, can I have my money back? Nope, see ya. So eventually we did land on a really good digital marketing firm, which in essence got us over the line.